These are the real stories of airline companies that rose fast, fell hard, and left thousands of passengers stranded in their wake. In this video, I'm going to count down 15 failed airline companies. Starting with number 15, WOW Air, Iceland's low-cost collapse. WOW Air was an Icelandic ultra-low-cost carrier that went from rapid rise to abrupt collapse in less than a decade. Founded in 2011 and launching flights in 2012, it was based in operations at the international airport near Reykjavik, and it was marketed extremely cheaply as transatlantic and European fares, often undercutting established airlines by a wide margin. Its purple aircraft became familiar sights at airports across Europe and North America as it built its network linking Iceland to more than 20 destinations. Their business model relied on point-to-point and connecting traffic between Europe and North America through Iceland, using single-aisled Airbus A320s and A321s. For several years, this strategy appeared to work. Passenger numbers in Iceland surged, and WOW Air carried a large share of the country's visitors. Well, later estimates put its contributions at more than a quarter of all visitors. This made the airline economically important for the wider Icelandic economy, including tourism, car rentals, restaurants, and construction. However, financially, the airline struggled. Public reporting and later analysis described persistent operating losses driven by thin margins, high fuel costs, and the expense of rapid expansion into long-haul markets like the United States and briefly India. As fuel prices rose and competition intensified on key routes, WOW Air's cost base outpaced its revenue growth. The airline responded by adding and then cutting routes at a fast pace, trying to find profitable combinations while dealing with debt and lease obligations on its fleet. In late 2018 and 2019, management sought a lifeline through strategic deals. They entered negotiations with Iceland Air Group and separately with the private equity firm Indigo Partners, which has stakes in several low-cost carriers. On March 28, 2019, WOW Air abruptly ceased operations. The airline published a short statement on its website informing passengers that all flights were canceled and advising them to contact other airlines or their travel providers. Other carriers and tourism authorities arranged some limited rescue fares, but many passengers had to rebook at their own expense. Its bankruptcy had clear macroeconomic effects. Official data and subsequent economic commentary recorded a double-digit percentage drop in tourist arrivals to Iceland. Growth forecasts for Iceland's economy were revised down, and unemployment rose as tourism-related construction slowed. A U.S. investor later acquired WOW Air's brand and announced relaunch plans, but journalists weren't able to verify any concrete steps. As of late 2025, WOW Air remains defunct, and it's frequently cited as a case study in how vulnerable ultra-low-cost long-haul airlines can be when financing dries up. Number 14. The fall of an aviation icon, Pan Am. Pan American World Airways. It's universally known as Pan Am. It was once the flagship of U.S. international aviation. Established in 1927, it pioneered scheduled service across the Caribbean and Latin America, then across the Atlantic and Pacific. Pan Am helped introduce jet airliners on long-haul routes and was an early customer for the Boeing 747, which it used to connect New York, Miami, and other U.S. gateways with Europe, Asia, Africa, and South America. For much of the 20th century, its global logo and Clipper call signs were synonymous with long-distance travel. The seeds of its decline, though, were sown over decades. After the 1973 oil crisis, the cost of jet fuel rose, and Pan Am had ordered a large fleet of wide-body aircraft on the assumption that passenger demand would continue to grow. Instead, demand softened and overcapacity developed, leaving the airline with high fixed costs and underutilized aircraft. U.S. airline deregulation in 1978 further weakened their position. The airline had concentrated on international services and didn't have a strong domestic network to feed its long-haul flights. After deregulation, other U.S. carriers and large domestic systems gained greater freedom to operate internationally, and that increased their competition. Pan Am then attempted to create its own domestic network by acquiring National Airlines in 1980. And the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie in Scotland on December 21, 1988 was another major blow. The attack killed 270 people and led to intense legal and regulatory scrutiny. By the late 1980s, Pan Am was selling core assets to survive. It had already sold its Pacific routes to United Airlines earlier in the decade, and in 1990 it sold most of its valuable London Heathrow routes. These sales generated short-term cash, but they reduced the scale and attractiveness of Pan Am's network. And when the 1990-91 Gulf War pushed fuel prices even higher and depressed transatlantic travel, the airline's position worsened. Pan Am filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on January 8, 1991. However, revenue in the late 1991 did fall well short of projections, and Delta declined to provide any further funding. And on December 4, 1991, Pan Am ceased operations after 64 years of flying. Around 7,500 employees lost their job, and other carriers quickly moved into its former markets. Today, Pan Am is widely cited in case studies as an example of how external shocks and structural disadvantages can bring down even the most recognizable brand in any industry. Number 13. The end of a 178-year travel empire, the Thomas Cook Airlines. Thomas Cook Airlines was part of the wider Thomas Cook Group, a British travel company founded in 1841 that grew into one of the largest tour operators in Europe. The airline itself operated primarily as a charter and leisure carrier, flying passengers from the UK and other European countries. Its fleet consisted of mainly Airbus A321s for short and medium-distance haul flights and Airbus A330s for long-haul routes. For many travelers, Thomas Cook Airlines was the air travel component of an all-inclusive package holiday, a business model that had been successful for decades. Trouble began, though, building long before the airline collapsed. The global shift towards independent travel, from consumers booking their own flights and accommodations online rather than buying traditional package holidays, gradually weakened the company's core business model. Profit margins tightened, and the company became more reliant on debt. Financial reports from the years leading up to 2019 show that Thomas Cook Group carried a heavy debt burden, making it vulnerable to seasonal downturns. The airline division itself wasn't considered the group's weakest segment. In fact, several analysts noted it was one of the better performing units, but it couldn't operate independently of the broader company's finances. Rising fuel prices, currency volatility following the 2016 Brexit referendum, and intense price competition in the leisure airline market all contributed to their financial strain. A possible bailout involving a Chinese conglomerate and several European banks reached an advanced stage, but ultimately fell apart when the lenders demanded an additional financial cushion. On September 23, 2019, Thomas Cook Group entered the compulsory liquidation, and Thomas Cook Airlines ceased operations the same day. The shutdown stranded more than 150,000 British travelers abroad, triggering what was described as the largest peacetime repatriation operation in British history. The UK Civil Aviation Authority chartered dozens of aircraft from various carriers to bring customers home. Employees across Europe, the pilots, cabin crew, mechanics, and administrative staff all lost their jobs almost overnight. Several parts of the airline did later re-emerge under new ownership. The company name itself was revived in 2020 as an online-only travel agency under new ownership, but the airline that once carried millions of people every year has not returned to service. Number 12. Monarch Airlines, a budget carrier that was undone by margin pressure. Monarch Airlines was another British low-cost charter carrier founded in 1967. For decades, it operated flights from UK cities like London, Birmingham, Manchester, and Leeds, Bradford to holiday destinations across Europe. It began as a charter-focused airline, but later transitioned towards a hybrid model, combining scheduled low-cost flights with its traditional holiday traffic. At its peak, Monarch carried more than 6 million people annually and was considered one of Britain's longest-standing leisure carriers. Despite the long history, though, they faced increasing financial difficulty in the 2010s. Competition in the European low-cost market intensified as carriers like Ryanair, EasyJet, Wizz Air, and Jet2 expanded. These airlines operated modern, fuel-efficient fleets and maintained extremely low cost structure. Monarch struggled to match these fare levels while maintaining profitability. Several management changes and strategic shifts did attempt to stabilize the business, including an investment from Greybow Capital in 2014, but it didn't resolve any deeper structural issues. By 2016 and 2017, financial filings showed sustained losses. The airline's aging fleet, too, meant higher maintenance costs and operating costs compared with newer competitors, and management sought additional investment and began exploring possible buyers. In late September of 2017, they narrowly secured a temporary extension of its air travel license, but the underlying financial situation still remained unsustainable. On October 2, 2017, Monarch Airlines ceased all operations and entered administration. Around 110,000 people were stranded abroad. It was surpassed only years later by the Thomas Cook collapse, and more than 1,800 employees did lose their jobs immediately. And although parts of Monarch's engineering business were sold and continued operating under new ownership, Monarch Airlines itself didn't relaunch. Its failure is cited as an example of how thin margins and volatile demand can bring down even well-established carriers. Number 11. Trans World Airlines. Trans World Airlines, it's commonly known as TWA. It was one of the most recognizable names in American aviation for a long time. It was founded in 1930 through the merger of several smaller airlines, and it became one of the Big Four U.S. carriers during the mid-20th century. For decades, TWA operated an extensive domestic network from hubs in St. Louis, New York, and Kansas City, and it was known for both innovation and celebrity associations, most notably during the period when businessman Howard Hughes held a controlling interest. TWA's decline began gradually, shaped largely by a changing competitive landscape after the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. Before deregulation, TWA benefited from route protections and stable fare structure. After deregulation, carriers could now enter each other's markets more freely. Airlines like American, United, and Delta expanded aggressively into long-haul and transcontinental routes that had once been TWA's strongholds. That shift made it more difficult for them to maintain their pricing power, and the airline struggled to adapt. Another factor was its ownership instability. In 1985, corporate raider Carl Icahn gained control of TWA. His tenure is widely viewed as one of the key triggers of the company's long-term problems. Icahn took TWA private in a leveraged buyout, loading the airline with debt that consumed much of its operating revenue. To generate cash, TWA sold assets, including profitable routes and London Heathrow slots, to other carriers, and while those sales provided some short-term liquidity, it also weakened TWA's network and long-term competitiveness. Throughout the 1990s, they faced repeated challenges. Rising fuel prices and aging aircraft that increased their costs. Competition intensified on nearly every major route. The company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy twice, first in 1992 and again in 1995, both times restructuring but not fully solving the underlying problems. In July of 1996, the crash of TWA Flight 800 added some further strain. Investigators attributed the accident to a fuel tank explosion caused by faulty wiring, but the disaster still damaged the airline's public image. TWA did continue to operate through the late 1990s, but it remained unprofitable. In 2001, the company filed for bankruptcy for the third time. This time, American Airlines agreed to acquire most of their assets, including Airlines, Gates, and its St. Louis operations. The sale closed in April of 2001, and TWA ceased to exist as an independent airline. Today, they're remembered for historic contributions to commercial aviation and for the lessons its collapse provides about deregulation, debt, and management strategy. The former routes and assets did help strengthen American Airlines' domestic network, but the TWA brand itself disappeared after more than 70 years of flying. Number 10. Mexicana de Aviación. Founded in 1921, Mexicana de Aviación was one of the world's oldest continually operating airlines, and for decades it served as one of Mexico's two major carriers alongside Aeromexico. It operated domestic and international flights to North America, Central and South America, and Europe, and it was a member of the One World Alliance during the 2000s. With hubs in Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey, Mexicana played a role in Mexico's aviation infrastructure, and it carried millions of people annually. In the early 2000s, though, the airline faced difficulties, many of which stemmed from privatization and restructuring. The Mexican government sold the airline in 2005 to a consortium that aimed to streamline their operations. However, financial filings from the period indicate that the airline continued to struggle with high costs. This put pressure on yield and forced the airline to reduce prices, which strained their profitability. Labor costs, too, also became a major issue. Mexicana had long-standing collective bargaining agreements with its pilot and flight attendant unions, and as financial pressure increased, they sought wage reductions and operational changes that were opposed by its workforce. At the same time, their fleet renewal efforts lagged. Many of the aircraft were older and less fuel efficient than those operated by newer competitors, which increased their maintenance costs and reduced their ability to compete on price. By 2009 and 10, Mexicana's financial situation had reached a critical point. They announced significant debt, rising fuel costs, and declining revenue, and attempted to restructure its operations, launching a new low-cost brand called Mexicana Link and adjusting its route network. But these moves did not produce the recovery management had hoped for. In August of 2010, Mexicana suspended ticket sales and soon after halted all operations, citing insolvency. More than 8,000 employees were affected, and for over a decade after the suspension there were numerous attempts to revive it, but none resulted in any sustained operation. In 2022, the Mexican government announced plans to launch a new state-run airline using the Mexicana brand, and it reached agreements to acquire the trademark and other assets. However, this entity is legally distinct from the historic Mexicana de Aviación that operated for nearly 90 years. The collapse of Mexicana reshaped aviation landscape in Mexico. Competing carriers expanded rapidly into the routes Mexicana once controlled, and the low-cost airlines emerged as dominant players in this domestic market. Number 9. Air Berlin. Air Berlin was once Germany's second-largest airline, operating a mix of leisure and full-service routes across Europe and the Middle East and North America. Founded in 1978 in the United States, because West Berlin at the time required airlines serving the city to be registered in the US, the UK, or France, it originally operated charter flights to Mediterranean destinations. And after the German reunification, the airline gradually transformed from a charter carrier into a hybrid operator. By the mid-2000s, Air Berlin had grown into a major competitor, acquiring DBA and LTU, additional long-haul routes, and joining the One World Alliance through its partnership with Etihad Airways. Despite the growth, though, the airline struggled. Its network became increasingly complex as it attempted to serve leisure and business markets, with a cost structure that didn't match true low-cost carriers. Integration of acquired companies did prove difficult, resulting in overlapping operations and differing labor agreements. Competition then intensified across Europe, especially from low-cost carriers like Ryanair, EasyJet, and Wizz Air. Financial reports leading up to 2017 show repeated annual losses and dependence on outside investment. Etihad Airways, which had purchased nearly 30% of Air Berlin, did provide hundreds of millions of euros in financial support, yet these measures didn't resolve Air Berlin's structural issue. In 2017, Etihad had announced it would no longer provide additional funding, and without continued backing from its largest investor, Air Berlin could not meet its costs. In August of 2017, the airline filed for insolvency, and despite the government's support to maintain short-term operations, Air Berlin gradually wound down. Long-haul flights ended in October of 2017, and domestic and European services ceased soon afterwards. Many of their aircraft and slots were taken over by Lufthansa and EasyJet, which expanded their operations in Berlin, Dusseldorf, and other key markets. The collapse affected about 8,000 employees, and it disrupted travel across Germany and Europe. And though parts of its operations were absorbed by other airlines, Air Berlin as a brand disappeared entirely. Number 8. Kingfisher Airlines. Kingfisher Airlines was an Indian carrier founded in 2005 by businessman Vijay Mallya. It's known for its premium service, newer aircraft, and strong brand presence. They differentiated themselves with features not common in India at the time, including personal entertainment screens on domestic flights and a focus on high-service branding. It operated Airbus A320 families of aircraft for domestic routes and later added the A330s for international service. India's aviation market in the 2000s, though, was extremely price-sensitive, with consumers gravitating towards low-fare carriers rather than premium service. Kingfisher operated with a cost structure closer to a full-service airline, but revenue often resembled that of a low-cost carrier due to competition and domestic routes. In 2008, Kingfisher acquired a controlling stake in Air Deccan, India's first low-cost carrier. The goal was to combine their route right and network with Kingfisher's brand and service. Instead, the merger introduced some complexity. Integrating two airlines with different fleets, labor structures, and business models proved to be challenging. By 2011 and 2012, they accumulated large debts owed to banks, fuel suppliers, airports, and employees, and reports from the period document extensive payment delays and grounded aircraft due to lack of maintenance. Indian aviation authorities, though, ultimately suspended the airline's license in late 2012 after Kingfisher failed to provide a viable financial plan and resolve their safety concerns. They formally ceased operations in October of 2012, and thousands of employees were left without pay, and creditors initiated legal proceedings to recover outstanding debts. Kingfisher's collapse did reshape India's airline industry. It did reduce capacity in the short term, but also created space for low-cost carriers like Indigo and SpiceJet to expand rapidly and capture any market share. Although there have been occasional discussions about reviving the Kingfisher brand, no credible plan has ever materialized, and the airline is defunct. Its failure is widely regarded as one of the most significant collapses in Indian aviation history. Number 7. Jet Airways. Jet Airways. This was founded in 1992, and they quickly grew into one of India's most respected airlines. By the mid-2000s, it operated an extensive domestic network and a growing list of international routes, including flights to Europe, North America, and Asia. They were known for their relatively high service standards. It competed directly with Air India in the full-service segment while also attempting to fend off emerging low-cost carriers. By the late 2000s and early 2010s, India's aviation landscape was changing. Low-cost carriers like Indigo, SpiceJet, or Go Air expanded aggressively, offering lower fares on higher-traffic domestic routes. Jet Airways attempted to respond, but their strategy created more complexity. Running two different models under the same corporate structure increased costs rather than lowering them. One major setback was Jet's purchase of Air Sahara in 2007. This acquisition was intended to strengthen the domestic network, but it was costly and produced disappointing returns. Over time, Jet Airways repeatedly restructured its operations, cutting unprofitable routes and attempting to streamline. But those measures didn't solve the underlying issue. And by 2018, the airline's financial problems had become severe. Rising fuel prices and a depreciating rupee increased operating costs. Potential investors explored rescue options, but none resulted in any workable deals. In April of 2019, Jet Airways suspended all operations after lenders declined to provide emergency funding. More than 20,000 employees were directly affected, and the sudden removal of one of India's largest carriers impacted the country's capacity of air travel. As of late 2025, though, revival efforts haven't led to any sustained commercial operations, and although a consortium acquired the rights to Jet Airways' brand and proposed a relaunch, some issues have delayed any return to service. The airline is a prominent example of how high debt and unsuccessful acquisitions will destabilize even a once dominant carrier. Number 6. Sabena of Belgium. The Belgian Public Limited Company for Air Navigation Operations, or Sabena, because I'm not reading that in French, was Belgium's national airline from 1923 until its collapse in 2001. For much of the 20th century, it operated an extensive network through Europe, Africa, and North America, and was an early adopter of jet aircraft. Brussels Airport became a major connecting point for passengers traveling between Europe and Central Africa, regions where Sabena maintained strong historic ties. It was majority-owned by the Belgian government, and financial reports over the years show chronic losses linked to high labor costs, an aging fleet, and limited ability to restructure due to political constraints. In the 1990s, they sought some new strategies to regain financial stability. It modernized its fleet by ordering Airbus A330s and A340s, and they pursued partnerships to strengthen the global reach. In 1995, Swissair acquired a stake in Sabena as part of a broader expansion strategy known as the Hunter Strategy, in which Swissair invested several European airlines to build a multi-carrier network. Instead, this strategy became a major factor in their eventual collapse. Swissair's own financial situation deteriorated and was unable to fulfill key funding obligations to Sabena. By 2001, it was running out of cash. It entered judicial administration in October and declared bankruptcy in November, ceasing all operations shortly afterwards. About 12,000 employees lost their jobs, and the shutdown struck Belgium's aviation infrastructure as Brussels Airport faced an immediate decline in passenger traffic. A new airline, SN Brussels Airline, emerged in 2002 from some of Sabena's remaining assets, and it later merged with Virgin Express to form Brussels Airlines, which is now part of the Lufthansa Group. However, Sabena itself was never revived, and this bankruptcy marked one of Europe's most significant airline collapses. Number 5. Swissair, the flying bank that couldn't survive its own expansion. Swissair, founded in 1931, was for decades one of the most respected airlines. It was known for reliability and service standards. It earned the nickname the Flying Bank because of its consistently solid balance sheets. Operating from its main hub in Zurich, Swissair built a global network that connected Europe to North America, Africa, and Asia. However, by the 1990s, the European aviation market was undergoing major changes. Deregulation within the European Union opened up new competition, and alliances like Star Alliance and One World reshaped the global airline cooperation. Swissair remained outside these major alliances and instead pursued a unique strategy, an attempt to build its own multi-airline network through equity investments. This became known as the Hunter strategy, under which Swissair bought stakes in several European carriers. The plan proved expensive and poorly timed. Many of the airlines Swissair acquired stakes in were already struggling. Instead of creating a profitable cooperation, the investments drained Swissair's own resources. By the early 2000s, the financial strain became severe. Reports from the period documented significant losses and growing debt. When Swissair was unable to secure additional financing in late 2001, partly due to tightened global financial conditions, following the September 11th attacks, the airline ran out of cash. On October 2, 2001, Swissair grounded all flights after fuel suppliers and service providers refused to continue operations without any guaranteed payment. The grounding lasted days and created widespread disruption. A successor airline, Swiss International Airlines, was formed and some assets of Swissair itself were sold. Initially independent, though, Swiss later joined Lufthansa Group, where it remains. Swissair was a carrier that was once known for its unmatched financial strength, but ultimately collapsed because it attempted to grow through acquisitions that exceeded its own resources. Number 4. Alitalia. Alitalia, founded in 1946, it served as Italy's national airline for 75 years. It operated a large domestic and international network from hubs in Rome and Milan. But despite all this prominence, Alitalia struggled financially for much of its existence. Records going back to the 1990s show repeated losses linked to high operating costs and labor disputes. And of course, being in Italy, political influence often shaped the airlines, its fleet choices and staffing levels, and those constraints limited their ability to restructure or cut unprofitable operations. Several attempts at privatization did unfold over the decades, and in 2008 a bankruptcy resulted in a split between Alitalia's healthy assets and its liabilities. In 2014, Etihad Airways acquired a 49% stake in Alitalia and introduced major strategic overhauls. Despite those efforts, though, profitability didn't improve. Alitalia's cost structure was high and competition, especially from Ryanair and EasyJet, continued to erode its market. A key event came in April of 2017, when employees voted against a proposed restructuring plan that included pay cuts and productivity improvements. Without union approval, major package collapsed and Alitalia entered extraordinary administration, which is a form of bankruptcy protection under Italian law. Attempts to find private buyers were unsuccessful, or potential investors were deterred by the scale of the debt and complexity of the required reforms, and in October of 2021, Alitalia ceased operations. Its successor, ITA Airways, took over a portion of its routes, fleet, and staff, but it's legally a different company. Although ITA Airways now carries Italy's flag internationally, the Alitalia name, once iconic in aviation, is retired. Number 3. Interjet. Interjet, founded in 2005, grew rapidly to become one of Mexico's major airlines. It positioned itself as a low-cost carrier, but offered amenities not always typical of that model, such as a more generous baggage policy and roomier seating. Operating mainly on an Airbus A320 family aircraft, along with a fleet of Sukhoi Superjet 100s, Interjet expanded its network to include domestic routes across Mexico. For several years, they maintained strong growth and a positive reputation among travelers. However, the airline's financial and operational issues began surfacing around the mid-2010s. One major challenge was the introduction of the Sukhoi Superjet 100. While the aircraft offered attractive purchase terms, it later proved difficult to maintain. Spare parts availability was inconsistent, and service centers were limited compared to the widespread support available for Airbus. By the late 2010s, industry observers noted that a large share of their Superjet fleet was grounded at any given time. The airline did accumulate significant debt, rising fuel costs and currency fluctuations affecting costs denominated in US dollars, and increasing competition from other low-cost carriers pressured their margins. By 2019, the financial strain was more visible. Flight delays and cancellations increased, sometimes affecting huge portions of their schedule, and in late 2020 the airline suspended international flights and drastically reduced domestic options. It also faced labor disputes, including strikes from employees who had gone months without receiving a full wage, and Interjet ceased commercial flights in December of 2020. Shortly afterwards, it entered bankruptcy proceedings, and by 2021 its remaining assets were largely inactive. Its collapse had a significant impact on Mexico's airline market. Competitors quickly absorbed the demand of Interjet's former routes, and Mexico City's congested airport system experienced a sudden shift in traffic. Their downfall is often cited as an example of how rapid expansion and problematic fleet choices can dismantle even a well-known and once popular low-cost carrier. Number 2. Spanair. Spanair was established in 1986 as a charter airline and later expanded into scheduled passenger services. Based in Barcelona, it was part-owned for many years by the Scandinavian airline SAS. During the 1990s and early 2000s, they grew into one of Spain's most significant carriers. Financial trouble, though, began emerging in the mid-2000s. Rising fuel prices, strong competition from low-cost carriers like Ryanair and EasyJet, and a weakening Spanish economy put pressure on their margins. A major turning point came in 2008 with the crash of Spanair flight JK5022 in Madrid. The accident, caused by a failed takeoff due to a combination of human and mechanical factors, resulted in 154 fatalities. While the investigators focused primarily on safety issues, the disaster caused a reputation hit. Passenger demand dropped, insurance and compensation costs rose, and the airline faced increasing regulatory scrutiny. By 2009, SAS, still a major shareholder, sought to sell its stake. Attempts to find a strategic investor failed, and the European Commission signaled concerns about additional state aid, limiting the government's ability to inject any further money. The situation deteriorated rapidly in early 2012. Fuel suppliers demanded payments in advance, bookings softened, and the airline struggled to meet basic expenses. On January 27, 2012, Spanair abruptly ceased all operations. Thousands of people were stranded, and more than 2,000 employees lost their jobs. The shutdown caused immediate disruptions at Spanish airports, particularly in Barcelona. This airline was formally liquidated after bankruptcy proceedings, and no successor brand ever emerged. Number 1. ATA Airlines. ATA Airlines, originally known as American Transair, was founded in 1973 in Indianapolis, Indiana. What began as a small charter operator flying a single Boeing 720 grew over the next 3 decades into one of the largest charter and scheduled airlines in the U.S. They became known for their military transport ops, scheduled leisure routes, and a diverse network that included flights to Hawaii, Mexico, and the Caribbean. At its peak, they carried millions of people annually and operated a sizable fleet of Boeing 737s, 757s, and 67s. ATA had found a niche that provided flights for tour operators and vacation packages and even U.S. military personnel, routes that were often less competitive than traditional markets. That steady revenue allowed the airline to gradually build a larger fleet. During that period in the 1980s, ATA developed strong connections in Chicago and various Midwest markets. The 1990s marked the height of ATA's growth, and they had long-haul routes expanding heavily into Hawaii service from multiple U.S. cities and became one of the Department of Defense's primary contractors for military charters. By the late 90s and early 2000s, they were transporting hundreds of thousands of military personnel every year under the Civil Reserve Air Fleet program. But behind all the expansion was a growing financial imbalance. They financed a significant portion of their fleet through debt, and as the airline expanded scheduled passenger operations, it entered increasingly competitive markets. Low-cost carriers like Southwest Airlines, JetBlue, and AirTran were growing rapidly. They tried to emulate some of those models, but it struggled with the complexity of running both a large charter operation and a scheduled airline. The early 2000s exposed some deeper vulnerabilities. After the September 11th attacks, the U.S. aviation industry experienced a decline in demand. Fuel prices increased, passenger loads thinned, and revenue fell. The airline filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in October of 2004. A possible lifeline arrived in 2004 when Southwest invested in ATA as part of a code-share partnership. However, the improvement was temporary. Fuel prices continued to rise in the mid-2000s, placing new pressure on ATA's fleet of older craft. Without revenue, the airline's financial footing deteriorated quickly. ATA attempted to secure new contracts and expand leisure service, but the route expansion was risky and often unprofitable. The decisive blow came in early 2008. ATA lost another major military charter contract, which represented a huge portion of its remaining charter revenue. And on April 2, 2008, ATA abruptly ceased all flights and filed for Chapter 11 for a second and final time. The collapse had both local and national consequences. Indianapolis, ATA's longtime home, lost one of its most significant employers. Chicago Midway, where ATA had once been the second largest carrier after Southwest, saw a sudden drop in capacity. Although ATA's brand briefly resurfaced in small corporate context after the shutdown, the airlines never returned to commercial service. This one shows how even large, well-established carriers can just unravel when the strategic risks accumulate faster than the organization can respond.